The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise. It was the silence. For 20 years, the western edge of my property had been lined with massive oak trees. Old trees. The kind that take generations to grow. When the wind moved through them, you could hear the leaves from the porch before you even saw the branches. That morning, the wind was still blowing. But there were no leaves. Just open sky. I parked the truck near the fence line and stepped out slowly. The ground looked wrong. Fresh dirt. Tire tracks. Sawdust scattered across the soil like someone had spilled sand. Then I saw the stumps. 1, 2, 5. By the time I reached the end of the line, there were 18 oak trees gone. Clean cuts. Heavy equipment work. Not storm damage. Not disease. Someone had planned this. Beyond the empty tree line, bright orange survey flags ran across the hillside like a trail. Wooden stakes marked out a grid that hadn't been there before. And farther up the slope stood a new sign. Future site, Ridgeview Resort Expansion. I hadn't even made it back from deployment 2 days earlier. A neighbor walking his dog slowed down when he saw me staring at the stumps. He hesitated before speaking. Then he said the sentence that told me everything. HOA said those trees weren't really yours, so they cleared them. I didn't yell. Didn't argue. I just pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of the stumps, the survey flags, the new resort sign. Because something about those stakes didn't look right. And if I was right about that survey line, the HOA hadn't just cut my trees. They had just made their entire project impossible. But they didn't know that yet. If you enjoy stories where patience, paperwork, and quiet discipline bring real accountability, make sure to subscribe. Here we follow real-style HOA conflicts where the loudest person doesn't win, the person who reads the documents carefully does. Because sometimes the truth is already written, and someone just has to find it. The property wasn't big. But it was quiet. A narrow stretch of land sitting just outside the ridge where the neighborhood ended and the hills began. When I bought it years ago, the development behind it was still small. A few houses, a couple of gravel roads, nothing that looked like trouble. Most people bought those homes for the same reason I bought my land. Peace. The western edge of my property was lined with oak trees. Old ones. Thick trunks, wide branches, the kind that had clearly been there longer than any of the houses behind them. They formed a natural boundary along the ridge. From my side, they gave shade and privacy. From the other side, they blocked the view. At the time, that didn't seem like a problem. The HOA back then mostly handled things like landscaping rules and mailbox paint colors. Nothing serious. Nothing that reached outside their neighborhood grid. But over the years the board changed. New members came in. Investors started buying property on the upper ridge. And slowly the tone shifted. Instead of talking about maintenance, the board started talking about development. Vacation rentals. Scenic overlooks. A resort-style expansion that would turn the hillside into a destination property. At one HOA meeting, a meeting I never even attended, the board president pointed toward the ridge and said something that neighbors later repeated to me. She said, "Those oak trees are blocking one of the best views in the county." After that, a few strange things started happening. Surveyors showed up near the ridge. Orange flags appeared along the tree line every now and then. Board members were seen walking the slope behind my property, measuring things, taking pictures. Most of the residents assumed it didn't matter. Because the trees weren't inside the HOA neighborhood. They were on my land. But before I left for deployment, I did something simple. Not because I expected a fight. Just because it was habit. Years working military logistics teaches you one thing very quickly. If something important depends on a map, you make sure you have the original one. So before leaving, I pulled the old documents from the county records. The deed. The original parcel survey. And one older map that showed something interesting running along the ridge. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just saved copies and left them in the property folder. Then I deployed. And while I was overseas, the HOA board started making decisions about the ridge. Decisions that only made sense if they believed those oak trees were standing in the wrong place. But the trees weren't the mistake. The map was. 2 days after I got back from deployment, the first official letter arrived. It wasn't an apology. It was an invoice. The envelope had the HOA logo stamped across the top. Inside was a neatly printed notice explaining that the oak trees along the ridge had been removed under a community development authorization. According to the letter, the trees had been standing inside what they called a shared scenic corridor easement. And since the clearing had been done for the benefit of the community, the cost had been divided. My share of that cost was listed at the bottom of the page. $8,460. I read the number again just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. They had cut down my trees and sent me the bill. The letter included a short statement from the HOA president. Those trees interfered with the approved view corridor for the upcoming ridge development project. There was also a map attached. A simple diagram showing the ridge, the cleared area, and a thin line running straight through the place where the trees used to stand. The line was labeled Scenic Corridor Easement. Most people probably would have reacted right there. Called the HOA. Argued. Threatened a lawsuit. I didn't. Instead, I looked closer at the map. It wasn't a county survey. It wasn't stamped by a licensed surveyor. It was a simplified planning sketch. That detail mattered. So I wrote a short reply and sent it to the HOA office the same afternoon. One sentence. Please provide the recorded easement document and the original survey used to authorize this removal. 3 days later, another letter arrived. The number had changed. Now the total was $12,900, including administrative processing fees. At the bottom of the page was a warning. If the balance wasn't paid within 30 days, the HOA would begin lien proceedings against the property. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table. Then I opened the folder containing the documents I had pulled before deployment. The deed, the original survey, and the older county map of the ridge. Because the HOA had just based an entire development project on one assumption, that their survey line was correct. But if the line on my map was the real one, then the trees they removed hadn't been blocking their view. They had been marking a boundary. A boundary their entire resort project had just crossed. A week passed. Then the second wave of paperwork started. The HOA didn't send explanations. They sent numbers. Another letter arrived, thicker this time. Inside was an updated statement showing that community clearing assessment had increased. $18,740. The explanation was simple: equipment costs, contractor fees, environmental disposal, administrative processing. The tone of the letter was even simpler. Payment was expected. At the bottom was a sentence written in the calm, confident language HOAs like to use. Failure to resolve this balance may result in lien proceedings and further legal action. I didn't call them. Didn't argue. Instead, I did what I'd spent most of my career doing. I started gathering information. The county planning office was only 20 minutes away. Most people never walk into those places unless they're already in trouble. But the clerks behind those counters deal with maps and records all day. And if you ask the right questions politely, they usually help. I requested public copies of the Ridgeview Resort expansion filing the HOA had mentioned in their brochure. Permit applications. Planning diagrams. Site surveys. It took about 15 minutes before a clerk came back with a stack of documents. Most of it looked exactly like what I expected. Architect sketches. Marketing renderings. Construction phases. But the important page was near the back. A survey map showing the planned expansion area. The cabins. The overlook decks. the access road that would climb the ridge and connect everything together. And right there, running along the lower edge of the project, was the same straight boundary line I had seen on the HOA letter. The scenic corridor. But something about the alignment felt wrong. Years working logistics teaches you how to read terrain lines quickly. Even a small shift in elevation or distance can change everything about how land can be used. So I pulled out the older county map from my folder. The one I printed before deployment. When I placed the two maps side by side, the difference was small. Just a few feet. Maybe 10 in some places. Most people would never notice it. But those few feet mattered. Because the developer's map pushed the boundary slightly downhill. Right into the area where the oak trees used to stand. Which meant the survey they were using assumed the ridge line started lower than it actually did. I asked the clerk a simple question. Do you have the recorded easement document for this corridor? She searched the system. Typed the easement number listed on the HOA letter. Nothing came up. She tried again. Still nothing. Finally, she leaned back and shook her head. That number doesn't match any recorded easement in the county database. I thanked her, collected the copies, and walked outside. The HOA thought they had paperwork on their side. They had already started clearing the ridge. Already started advertising the resort project. Already started charging me for the trees they removed. But if the document they claimed existed didn't actually exist, then their entire project depended on a survey line that might not legally exist either. And if that line moved back even a few feet, the resort expansion wouldn't just be delayed. It would become impossible to build. But before any of that could happen, the HOA board made their next move. Because 2 days later, another envelope arrived. This one marked Final Notice Before Lien. The envelope labeled Final Notice Before Lien arrived on a Thursday. Inside was a thicker packet than before. Several pages this time. Formal language. Legal tone. The number had changed again. $31,480. The letter explained that additional contractor costs, survey adjustments, and project delays had been added to the original clearing assessment. At the bottom was a deadline. 14 days. If the balance wasn't paid, the HOA would proceed with filing a property lien. Most people would panic at that point. Liens are designed to do exactly that. They sit on your property title like a shadow, blocking sales, loans, and refinancing until the debt is resolved. But what caught my attention wasn't the number. It was the timing. Because that same weekend the HOA scheduled a community development meeting. Residents received invitations in their mailboxes. The board wanted to present the official progress update for the Ridgeview Resort expansion. I went. The meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the top of the hill. Folding chairs, projector screen, a long table where the board members sat facing the room. The HOA president stood at the front with a microphone, confidently walking everyone through slides of the planned resort. Luxury cabins. Observation decks. A new scenic access road. Property values rising. Tourism revenue. Applause filled the room. Then she switched to another slide. A photo of the cleared ridge line. The place where my oak trees had been. This view corridor, she said proudly, was recently opened after resolving a private land dispute that had been blocking the project. Several heads turned in my direction. She continued. The homeowner responsible for the obstruction has been notified and is currently responsible for the clearing costs. The word obstruction hung in the air for a moment. Someone in the audience asked if the issue might delay the resort project. The president smiled confidently. No, she said. We have full documentation supporting the corridor easement. The matter is already being resolved through proper channels. A few people nodded. Some even clapped. Then she added one more sentence, looking directly toward me. Military service doesn't place anyone above community rules. The room went quiet. I didn't respond. Didn't argue. I simply took a notebook from my jacket pocket and wrote down the easement number she repeated on the screen. After the presentation ended, residents gathered around the board table asking questions about future cabin reservations and investment opportunities. No one asked about the missing trees. No one asked where the easement document actually came from. As I walked toward the exit, the HOA property manager stopped me near the door. "You should really consider paying the balance before the lien process starts," he said quietly. "Once that happens, things get much more complicated." I nodded politely. Then I stepped outside into the cool evening air and looked up at the ridge where the trees used to stand. The survey stakes were still there. Bright orange flags running across the slope. The HOA board believed they had already won. They had the project. They had the documents. They had the community on their side. And soon, they believed, they would have the lien. But there was one small problem they hadn't noticed yet. The easement number they kept quoting still didn't exist in the county records. And if the easement didn't exist, then the entire resort project sitting behind it didn't legally exist either. That night the house felt quieter than usual. The wind still moved across the ridge, but without the oak trees the sound was different. Lighter. Empty. I sat at the kitchen table with the stack of documents spread out in front of me. The HOA letters. The resort development plans. The survey maps from the county office. And the lien notice sitting on top of everything. $31,480. The number looked larger every time I saw it. I'd dealt with pressure before. Military deployments teach you how to operate when things go wrong. Equipment failures. Supply routes collapsing. Plans that fall apart at the worst possible moment. But this felt different. Because this wasn't a battlefield problem. This was paperwork. And paperwork moves slowly. The HOA knew that. Liens are designed to squeeze people into fast decisions. Pay the balance, avoid the trouble, move on. Most homeowners would have done exactly that. Pay the money. Cut their losses. Let the trees go. For a moment, I understood the temptation. It would have been easy to write the check and end the entire fight. But something about the ridge line kept bothering me. Not the missing trees. The survey line. I looked again at the older county map I had printed before deployment. The one that showed the ridge the way it had been drawn decades earlier. A thin strip ran along the slope. Barely noticeable unless you knew what you were looking at. The oak trees had followed that line almost perfectly. Nature doesn't usually grow in straight rows. But boundaries do. And if those trees had been planted to mark something, then removing them hadn't just cleared the view. It had erased the only visible marker for whatever that line actually meant. I leaned back in the chair and looked toward the dark ridge outside the window. The HOA believed they were winning. They had the board. The community. The lien process. But systems only work when the original rules are still in place. And somewhere in the county archives, there had to be a document explaining why that line existed. Because if I was right about what the trees had been marking, then the HOA hadn't just crossed a property boundary. They had crossed a line that might stop their entire resort project. 10 days later the HOA made their move. A certified letter arrived just after noon. The kind that requires a signature at the door. Inside was the document they had been threatening for weeks. Notice of lien filing. The board had officially placed a claim against my property for the clearing costs and accumulated penalties. The updated balance was printed in bold near the top of the page. $37,960. The letter explained that if the balance remained unpaid, the HOA would move forward with further legal action. Interest would continue to grow. Court costs would be added. And if necessary, the property could eventually be forced into sale to recover the debt. It was the kind of language designed to end a fight quickly. And from the outside, it looked like it had. That same week the HOA president sent out another community newsletter. The resort expansion project was officially moving into the site preparation phase. Surveyors had finished marking the ridge. Developers had begun preparing grading permits. Construction equipment was scheduled to arrive within the month. Neighbors started talking about the changes that were coming. Higher property values. Tourists visiting the ridge overlook. New businesses opening nearby. From their perspective, the conflict over the oak trees had already been resolved. The obstruction had been cleared. The homeowner responsible had been charged. The project was moving forward. Even the developer seemed confident. Temporary markers appeared along the hillside showing where the future access road would climb the ridge. Workers began measuring the slope where the first cabins were supposed to be built. Standing near the edge of the property line, you could already see the outline of the project taking shape. From the HOA board's point of view, everything was working exactly the way they expected. They had removed the trees. They had secured the lane. And they believed the land dispute was finished. But the same afternoon the lien notice arrived. I walked back into the county planning office. Not to argue. Not to file a complaint. Just to submit one quiet request. A formal survey verification review for the ridge boundary used in the Ridgeview Resort expansion. Because if the survey line the developer used was wrong, then the entire project sitting behind it wasn't just risky. It was illegal to build. The county survey office wasn't a dramatic place. No courtrooms. No arguments. Just long counters, quiet offices, and shelves full of maps that most people never look at. When I filed the survey verification request, the clerk simply stamped the paperwork and passed it to the survey department. 3 days later my phone rang. A county survey technician asked if I could come in. When I arrived, he already had the resort expansion map spread across a large drafting table. Next to it was the older county parcel map I had submitted. He didn't look confused. He looked curious. "You're right about something," he said. Then he pointed to the ridge line on the developer's survey. According to the expansion plans, the boundary ran straight through the area where my oak trees had stood. But when he overlaid the county parcel data on top of the developer's survey, the lines didn't match. Not exactly. The developer's version pushed the boundary downhill by several feet. Just enough to clear space for the new access road and the first row of resort cabins. The technician leaned back and tapped the older map. "This line here," he said, pointing to the thin strip along the ridge, "has been recorded in the county system for decades." I asked him what it was. He shook his head slightly. "That's the strange part," he said. "The label is partially missing in the digital archive. The system only shows the boundary outline. In other words, the line existed, but the document explaining it hadn't been opened yet, which meant the developer's survey might be ignoring something that had been legally recorded long before the HOA ever existed." The technician closed the map folder and stood up. "There's one place the original document would still be stored," he said. "The county archive vault." Then he looked back at the ridge line drawn across the map. "And if that record says what I think it might." He didn't finish the sentence. But he didn't need to. Because if that old document confirmed what the boundary actually was, the HOA hadn't just made a small survey mistake. They had built their entire resort expansion on land they weren't legally allowed to touch. 2 days after the visit to the survey office, the county technician called again. His voice sounded different this time. Less curious. More careful. "Your document is here," he said. The archive staff pulled the original record. The county archive vault sat in the lower level of the administration building. It wasn't a place most people ever visited. Thick metal shelving, long drawers filled with rolled maps, and records dating back generations. The technician met me at one of the large tables. In front of him was a long protective tube. Inside it was a rolled survey sheet sealed in a thin plastic sleeve. The label on the outside showed a year that immediately stood out. 1974. Most of these older surveys were done before the ridge development existed, he explained as he carefully unrolled the map. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the ink lines were still sharp. Across the ridge was the same narrow strip we had seen on the digital parcel map. But this time the label was fully visible. Ridge Environmental Protection Corridor. The technician tapped the text with his finger. This corridor was created when the county approved early development on the hillside, he said. The land was considered erosion sensitive. The map included several notes written by the original surveyor. No permanent structures permitted inside the corridor. No grading or road construction. And one final instruction that explained everything about the missing oak trees. Boundary markers to be maintained along corridor line. The technician looked up at me. Those trees, he said, weren't random. They had been planted deliberately decades earlier to mark the protected boundary. Which meant when the HOA contractors cut them down, they hadn't just removed landscaping. They had erased the physical markers for a legally protected development buffer. The technician began overlaying the old corridor map with the resort expansion plans. The result was immediate. The first row of planned resort cabins sat directly inside the corridor. The scenic overlook platform crossed even deeper into it. And the most serious problem of all was the new access road the developer planned to carve into the ridge. That road ran straight through the center of the protected strip. The technician leaned back in his chair. Without the trees, he said quietly, it would have been easy to assume the ridge line moved downhill. Which is exactly what the developer's modern survey had done. Their map had shifted the boundary just far enough to clear space for the resort project. But the moment the corridor record was applied, everything changed. The cabins couldn't be built. The overlook platform couldn't be built. And the access road that connected the entire resort project became impossible. Because any grading or construction inside the environmental corridor violated the original county protection order. The technician began filling out a verification report. Once filed, the county planning office would be required to review the resort permits again. And this time they would have to apply the original corridor boundary. I asked the technician what that would mean for the project. He paused before answering. The permit review would likely stop construction immediately. The developer had already started preparing the ridge. Clearing land. Planning grading work. Scheduling equipment. If the corridor map was enforced, those permits would have to be suspended. Possibly revoked. But the problem for the HOA didn't stop there. Because the removal of the oak trees had created a second issue. Those trees had been the required visible boundary markers for the corridor. Destroying them meant the HOA contractors had removed environmental protection markers tied to a recorded county regulation. Which meant the county could also investigate unauthorized removal of protected boundary indicators. The technician finished the verification report and placed the documents back inside the protective sleeve. The corridor map. The survey overlays. The planning notes. Then he slid the paperwork across the table. This will go to the planning board tomorrow, he said. From there, the county would notify the developer and the HOA that the ridge expansion project had to be reviewed under the environmental corridor restrictions. I thanked him and rolled the documents back into the tube. Walking out of the archive building, the ridge was visible in the distance beyond the parking lot. From where I stood, the hillside looked exactly the way it had a month earlier. Open. Clear. Ready for construction. Which is exactly what the HOA board believed they had accomplished. They thought removing the trees had cleared their biggest obstacle. They thought the lien notice had forced the land dispute to end. They thought the resort project was already moving forward. What they didn't know yet was that the trees they cut down had never been the obstacle. They had been the warning. And now the one document that proved it was heading straight to the county planning board, where the HOA president would have to explain how her view corridor had accidentally crossed a protected environmental boundary that made the entire resort impossible to build. The county planning hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning. It wasn't a courtroom. No dramatic benches or gavels. Just a long municipal meeting room with rows of chairs and a raised desk where the planning board members sat. But that morning the room was unusually full. Developers, HOA board members, several residents from the hillside neighborhood, and a few county staff from the survey department. At the center table sat the development representatives for the Ridgeview Resort Expansion Project. Their large presentation boards leaned against the wall, showing the same polished renderings the HOA had displayed weeks earlier. Luxury cabins along the ridge. Observation decks overlooking the valley. A winding access road climbing the slope where the oak trees had once stood. The HOA president sat beside the developer's attorney, flipping through a binder of documents with the calm confidence she had shown at every meeting before. From her perspective, this hearing was probably just another routine permit step. A technical review. Nothing serious. When the planning board chair called the session to order, the developer spoke first. He walked the board through the project timeline. The clearing phase had already begun. Survey lines had been established. Construction equipment was scheduled to arrive within weeks. He described the project as a major improvement for the community. Tourism, local revenue, increased property values. When he finished, the HOA president leaned forward and added her own statement. Our board has fully resolved the only land dispute that was slowing progress, she said. The homeowner responsible for the obstruction has already been notified and assessed the clearing costs. Several board members nodded politely. Everything sounded orderly. Routine. Until the county survey technician stood up. He walked to the center of the room carrying a long map tube. Without saying much, he unrolled the first survey sheet across the presentation table. It was the developer's modern survey. The same map the HOA had been using to justify the ridge expansion. Cabin locations. The access road. The scenic overlook platform. Everything neatly arranged along the hillside. The technician let the room study it for a moment. Then he placed a second map directly on top of the first. This one looked older. The paper slightly yellowed. Handwritten survey notes along the edges. And across the ridge line ran a narrow strip labeled clearly in bold lettering. Ridge Environmental Protection Corridor. The room grew quiet. The technician began speaking in the steady tone of someone used to explaining technical details to people who would rather not hear them. This document was recorded with the county in 1974, he said. It establishes a protected environmental corridor along the ridge to prevent erosion and preserve slope stability. He traced the line with his finger. The boundary of this corridor was historically marked by a row of oak trees planted along the ridge. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. The technician then slid the developer's modern survey slightly to the side so both lines could be seen clearly. And that's when the difference became obvious. The developer's survey had moved the ridge boundary downhill. Just far enough to allow the resort project to fit. But when the original corridor line was applied, the cabins crossed into protected land. The overlook platform sat deep inside the corridor. And the access road ran straight through the center of it. The developer leaned forward, studying the map more closely. The attorney beside him whispered something urgently. Across the table, the HOA president looked at the corridor label as if she were seeing it for the first time. The planning board chair asked the survey technician a simple question. Does this corridor remain legally valid? The technician nodded. Yes. It was never removed from the county records. Which means all development proposals must comply with its restrictions. The chair looked down at the developer's map again. And those restrictions prohibit permanent structures inside the corridor? Correct. A long silence followed. The developer began flipping through his documents. The attorney leaned toward the HOA president and whispered again. The room had gone from confident to uncertain in less than 60 seconds. Finally, the planning board chair looked toward me. You submitted the survey verification request that led to this review? I nodded. He gestured toward the maps. Would you like to explain what led you to question the boundary? I stood and walked to the table. For a moment I simply looked at the two maps side by side. The modern survey and the older corridor record. Then I spoke. The oak trees along the ridge followed this corridor line almost exactly. I tapped the older map. When they were removed, the only visible marker for the boundary disappeared. The HOA president shifted in her chair. But the corridor still existed, I continued. And the resort expansion survey was drawn as if it didn't. The planning board members studied the maps again. The developer leaned back slowly in his chair. Then the HOA president spoke for the first time since the corridor document appeared. Our board acted based on the survey we were provided, she said quickly. The county technician responded calmly. That survey ignored a recorded environmental protection boundary. The room fell quiet again. I looked at the ridgeline on the map one more time. Then I said the only sentence that needed to be said. Those trees weren't blocking the view. I pointed to the corridor line. They were marking the place the resort project was never allowed to cross. The planning board chair nodded slowly. Then he looked down at the development permit file sitting in front of him. And with a single motion, he closed it. The room stayed quiet for several seconds after the planning board chair closed the permit file. For the first time since the resort expansion had been announced, the project no longer looked inevitable. It looked fragile. The chair turned to the county survey technician. Based on the corridor record, he asked, does the current development plan comply with county land use restrictions? The technician didn't hesitate. No. He pointed to the map again. The access road, observation deck, and at least 6 of the proposed cabin sites all fall inside the environmental protection corridor. The developer's attorney leaned forward immediately. There may be ways to adjust the site layout. The chair raised a hand. You can submit a revised proposal, he said calmly. But under the current design, the permit cannot be approved. A quiet murmur spread through the room. For weeks the HOA had been presenting the resort expansion as a finished deal. Construction schedules, investor interest, reservation plans. But the entire project depended on the Ridge Access Road. And that road ran directly through the protected corridor. Without the road, there was no practical way to reach the cabin sites higher up the slope. The planning board chair turned another page in the file. There is also a second issue, he said. He looked toward the county survey technician. The corridor boundary markers. The technician nodded. The oak trees that were removed along the ridge were serving as the historical visual markers for the corridor boundary. The chair looked toward the HOA president. Were you aware that those trees marked a protected development buffer? The president hesitated. Our board relied on the developer's survey. That wasn't the question, the chair replied calmly. The room went quiet again. The technician spoke once more. Removing the trees eliminated the physical markers required under the original corridor documentation. The chair folded his hands on the desk. In that case, he said, the county will need to review whether the clearing violated environmental protection requirements. That sentence changed the atmosphere in the room completely. The HOA president had arrived expecting to defend a construction project. Now she was facing the possibility of an environmental violation review. The developer leaned back in his chair, looking at the maps again with a much more serious expression. The board chair continued. The Ridgeview Resort expansion permit is hereby suspended pending review of the corridor restrictions. Another quiet wave moved through the room. Then he added one more decision. The lien dispute connected to the clearing assessment appears to be based on the assumption that the trees were removed legally. He glanced at the county technician. If the removal interfered with protected boundary markers, that assumption may not hold. The technician nodded slightly. The chair closed the permit folder again. In that case, the county recommends that any financial claims tied to that clearing be reconsidered until the review is complete. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. if the county determined the trees should never have been removed in the first place. The HOA's entire claim against my property could collapse. The penalties, the fees, the lien, all of it. The developer's attorney quietly gathered his documents. The HOA president sat motionless for a moment, staring at the old corridor map still lying across the table. A month earlier she had stood in front of the neighborhood clubhouse promising a luxury resort overlooking the valley. Now the project had stopped before the first foundation was even poured, because of a line on a 40-year-old map, and the trees that had once marked it. The planning board chair gave one final instruction. The county survey department will work with the environmental office to restore proper boundary markers along the corridor. Then he looked around the room. This hearing is concluded. The gavel didn't fall. There was no dramatic ending. Just the quiet sound of chairs sliding back as people slowly stood up. The resort project that had seemed unstoppable a few weeks earlier had just been shut down by something the HOA board had never bothered to check. The original map. A few weeks later the ridge looked different again. Not the way it had before the clearing. The old oak trees were gone, and trees like that take generations to replace. But along the ridge line, new markers had appeared. Small wooden posts placed carefully along the exact path shown on the corridor survey. Each one carried a simple county label. Environmental Protection Boundary. The county required the HOA to remove the lien while the environmental review continued. The clearing assessment disappeared from my property record as quietly as it had arrived. The resort expansion project never returned to the planning board in its original form. Without the ridge access road, the development plan simply didn't work. Most of the residents stopped talking about the project altogether. One afternoon I walked the ridge again, following the line where the oak trees had once stood. The wind moved across the hillside the same way it always had. The view hadn't changed. Only the assumptions about who controlled it. People sometimes think conflicts like this are won by arguing louder than the other side. But most of the time, the outcome is decided long before anyone raises their voice. It's written quietly into the documents. And sometimes all it takes to stop something big is reading the original map.